Castlevania Symphony of the Night was released in 1994 for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. Made by Konami and directed by Toru Hagihara and more influentially Koji Igarashi, the game was intended as a bold new direction for the Castlevania franchise for this new generation of consoles. Taking inspiration from the Legend of Zelda series and even the previous Castlevania entry, Rondo of Blood, the game took a non-linear approach to gameplay with a focus on exploration rather than tightly designed action-based levels as was seen in earlier entries. The result, while not a financial success at the start of its lifespan, was one of the most influential and important games going into the modern era, and what ultimately spawned the hugely successful Metroidvania genre as we know it. It's also not the game for... I'm kidding. Of course, Symphony of the Night is fucking awesome. However, that doesn't mean I can't still complain about it, so let's get into it and see what works and what doesn't. Castlevania is a series about the battle between fundamental good and fundamental evil. It follows a cyclical nature of evil rising, most often in the form of the all-powerful vampire Dracula, and the good that rises to meet it, most often in the form of the next descendant of the Belmont clan of monster hunters, who wield the famous vampire killer whip as their signature weapon. Past and future games have iterated and reiterated on this formula, such as Portrait of Ruin, starring a non-Belmont who must come to master their innate powers that he doesn't have, Lament of Innocence, showing the formation of the vampire killer and the birth of Dracula as an old friend of the first proper Belmont, and even Castlevania II Simon's Quest, detailing the aftermath of a battle with Dracula involving a life-threatening curse and having to resurrect and destroy the soul of Dracula once and for all. Symphony of the Night arguably does more for the series than most, offering a complete role reversal of good and evil, while also retaining the spirit of gothic horror that the series thrives on. It opens by establishing itself as a direct sequel to Rondo of Blood, where Richter Belmont defeated Dracula in a harrowing adventure. 4 years later, however, Dracula's castle rises again, and the Belmont is nowhere to be found. Woken from his centuries-long slumber, Dracula's half-vampire son Alucard rushes to investigate, and as the gate shuts behind him, the game begins in earnest. Welcome to the power trip. The opening minutes of the game sell the idea alone. Alucard is incredibly powerful, able to calmly and efficiently one-shot even these badass wolves that explode into fire upon death. The rug is then promptly ripped out from under the player by Death himself, and all of the equipment that enabled the power trip is taken away from you. Instantly, even if you aren't invested in the story, the player is given an incentive to explore and grow stronger so that you can beat up Death and regain your cool stuff. That said, you then get a dinky little sword from your first skeleton kill, and then the game begins in earnest again. As we saw in Super Metroid, the progression of the game plays out by going to different areas, looting them for all they're worth, finding new ways to traverse the world, and gain access to new areas. However, unlike Super Metroid, which had the linear goal right from the start of defeating the 4 bosses to gain access to the final area, in Symphony of the Night, the bosses are secondary to the progression. Yes, you have to fight most of them to gain access to those upgrades, but the fights aren't the goals in themselves, such as fighting the werewolf and minotaur in the Colosseum, which inadvertently gives you access to the form of mist. Yes, you must fight them, but the item you get isn't a direct result from a narrative or world sense, just from a level design perspective. I find this method of progression more generally engaging than Super Metroid's, and that has to do with how the game frames progress. In the end, we need to get to the top of the castle just like in every other Castlevania game, so progress would naturally involve finding ways to get closer to the top, with combat being used as a means to an end of achieving that goal. This is the formula that most Metroidvanias will adopt going forward, especially those without a pronounced combat system, such as Ori and the Blind Forest. During this retrospective, we're going to be going over common ground in a lot of entries with what we discuss. The commonalities within the genre are plentiful, and determining the worth of any individual entry will largely be based on how well it uses and reiterates upon the common elements, those being movement and environments, boss and encounter quality, and loot quality. Within Castlevania Symphony of the Night, it excels particularly in the case of the environments. There are many individual areas within Dracula's castle that are so visually distinct from each other, from the opulence and splendor of the alchemical lab and marble gallery, to areas so run down that they might as well be abandoned ruins, like the bell towers in the royal chapel, or the pillars and broken walkways in the clock tower and castle keep. However, I do feel like the game, and the series as a whole if I'm being honest, never truly lives up to its potential in this regard. I'm not saying I want a straight ripoff of Bram Stoker's Dracula in game form. I do like that these are ultimately action games, but at the same time, the work done to incorporate that gothic atmosphere is usually ignored because the rest of the game makes the player feel so freaking awesome. The reason horror works in most traditional cases is the perceived difference in threats between two opposing parties. This is where you get the final girl versus the big bad killer trope, as it's this idea taken to its logical extreme. In the Castlevania series, Symphony of the Night included, you are also an ultra badass and can absolutely stand up to anything the game throws at you. Hell, Symphony of the Night makes a point of it with the first few minutes as Alucard. So yeah, this game has all of these unique environments with a bunch of creepy enemy designs and cool background details to make this feel like an old horror movie set, but at the end of the day, you're just gonna go through the game with reckless abandon because that's what it teaches you to do in its early stages. Speaking of its early stages though, I want to gush for a minute. The Alchemical Lab has one of my favorite moments in the game. The first boss is against Slagra and Gaibon, two iconic villains if ever there were some. But anyway, if you kill the grounded one first, which is likely as it's usually easier to hit, then the flyer becomes powered up, to the point that it honestly feels impossible to beat for a first-time player. However, if you've explored enough in the Alchemical Lab, you'll have found the leather shield, which when used, can completely negate the boss's powered-up fireballs. Rewarding the player for exploration is the cornerstone of the Metroidvania genre, and the fact that this game nailed it in not just the first try for the genre, but in its very first true area is a testament to how well the developers understood what kind of game they were making when it comes to its world design. I know that may seem like high praise, but that's because it's deserving of it. That said, when it comes to its combat system, they may have missed the mark a bit. Let's start with the positives, especially in comparison to Super Metroid. Instead of a shot, you have the various melee weapons that Alucard finds throughout his journey through the castle, most often being swords or maces. With few exceptions, attacks are instantaneous. As soon as you hit the attack button, the damage window activates. This alone makes the combat feel more purposeful and tight than in Super Metroid, and contributes a lot to my enjoyment of the exploration. Enemies are liberally strewn through the various hallways found within Dracula's domain, and beating up on them is usually satisfying. This is the only bit of improvement to be found in this series, however. The issues are many, so let's start chipping away at them. First, I said that hitting enemies is usually satisfying. Well, this is only really true to a point, when it takes less than around 3 or 4 hits to beat them, I would say. Any more than that, and just how weightless and weak your attacks feel comes into very sharp focus. Don't get me wrong, I'm not expecting Alucard to do the stuff he does in like the recent anime. I'm not asking for super over-the-top animations like in a Kingdom Hearts game, don't worry about it. However, with his single sword swing animation and almost no enemy recoil, it makes hitting an enemy multiple times feel eerily like you're slashing through a fart cloud, and it stinks just as much. I found that this is less of an issue with aerial enemies, as each hit feels much more purposeful as a baseline thanks to the commitment involved with the jump to reach them, whereas grounded enemies either just take it, or you have to use Alucard's backdash to avoid a retaliation, and then repeat the process. I think rebalancing damage to be harsher and implementing a Zelda 2 style freeze effect to your hits would solve this problem, and honestly, it would probably solve the next issue I have as well. Getting hit in Symphony of the Night is brutal. Despite how many innovations were made within the Castlevania series here, one thing that stuck around from the old school days was the ridiculous knockback associated with getting hit. It was a bone of contention even in the original game, since it caused Simon to fall into holes and die far too often. And while there are no instant death pits in Symphony of the Night, it perhaps causes an even bigger moment-to-moment problem. It breaks up the pace of the game. Getting hit and Alucard reacting so violently is a harsh stop to any amount of flow that the player finds themselves in. This is like if you always reset to neutral in a fighting game. It's not natural for enemies to not press their attack when they have the advantage. And yet, when you get hit, you're forced so far back that it acts as its own invulnerability window. And believe me, I'd love if this was the effect for bosses or tougher enemies only. It would really sell the power of their attacks and make me feel like I'm overcoming a huge challenge by dodging them or killing them. But this is the only recoil animation. Every time you get hit, whether from Slagra and Gaibon or a fucking bat, you fly backwards like Serenity when the duel hasn't even started yet.
Serenity, the duel hasn't even started yet.
It's by far the worst thing in the game on a moment-to-moment basis. That said, the game also has some structural problems when it comes to its combat. So, magic spells are a thing, and they're, in a word, broken as hell. Though you need to find or buy certain scrolls to learn the necessary button combinations of the spells, all of them are available for use from the outset. Early on and even in the mid-game, Tetra Spirit is your best damage against any opponent. And this is honestly fine. It's fun to use, and it's balanced as being essentially a New Game Plus option since you'll only know how to use it with either outside help or a scroll from later in the game. My issue with it is that the game is imperfect when it comes to reading edge cases on its input. To my taste, button combinations should be as far as we go when programming certain moves, especially in an action game. I personally don't find it fun to hold up, do a half circle down, and then press attack to bust out my fuck you move. It's clunky to execute, and the amount of time necessary to hold up is incredibly hard to gauge when in the middle of an encounter, making it unreliable. The same can be said of a more niche example, that being special attacks based on your weapon. Activated via a quarter circle forward motion or a back forward motion, neither of which feels consistent at all. Now before I continue bitching, let's catch up on our progress. We've gone through the alchemical lab, the marble gallery, the outer wall, and the long library, at which point we've gotten a few things, namely the Soul of Wolf and the Jewel of Open. Strangely, the two most boring upgrades are the ones you get first. I don't necessarily consider this an issue, as even a casual player like me was able to get to the first interesting one within just over an hour and a half. The Soul of Wolf is one of 3 transformations in the game along with Fog and Bat, and is mainly used for lateral movement. However, in order to have the piercing property necessary to go through enemies, you need to build up a ridiculous amount of speed, so uses for it are very limited in the enemy-dense castle. Not to mention, the Bat is better at lateral movement later in the game anyway. The Jewel of Open, meanwhile, is a simple key needed to open blue doors. It's basic, yes, but as a first item, it at least does well in teaching the player that items gained will indeed unlock new paths, though no other example is quite so obvious. Now back in Super Metroid, I mentioned that the lack of fast travel really hurt that game's exploration feel due to the amount of boring backtracking needed to actually get anything useful, or even to just get to where you needed to go in a timely manner. Some people do disagree, but casual players don't know the shortcuts and sequence breaks, so my point stands for them. In any case, Symphony of the Night corrects this by implementing such a system, in the form of 5 rooms dedicated specifically to fast travel. I want to say right now that I'm glad that they're here, as without them, the game would be much more of a slog. Even just right now, we've traversed basically the entire breadth of the map, and our next destination, though we can take a short detour into the underground section if we want, is found back at the start. Conveniently, there was a teleport room at that start, and also one here in the outer wall, so it's super easy so long as we entered both of these rooms at some point. Now that I've praised the fast travel though, let me complain about it again. First, though I think this may be hardware limitations more than anything, there aren't enough fast travel points for my liking. I'm not saying we need one per area like in something like Hollow Knight, nor am I saying that we need instantaneous fast travel like in Breath of the Wild or, to an extent, the Ori duology. However, currently there are only 5 fast travel points, 3 in the center at the bottom, middle, and top, 1 in the lower left, and 1 in the upper right. This is generally fine, but it restricts the player in ways that I don't think is really fun. For example, there's an item necessary for completion up in the top left in our actual next destination, the Royal Chapel. And getting back to it after you have gotten the necessary items to actually reach the room that it's located in, while the trek back to it is not as much of a slog as it was to backtrack in Super Metroid, it isn't engaging when the destination itself isn't really substantial except as another necessary collectible. Adding a teleport room into the Royal Chapel would probably be enough to fix the issue, as by the time you're expected to go anywhere near the catacombs, you'll have all of the tools necessary to collect everything, so backtracking there is less necessary. At the end of the Royal Chapel line, you get the Leap Stone, which is this game's form of double jump. This is an upgrade that would become synonymous for the genre in a way that it does with few others. In every other type of game that has a double jump, you tend to have it from the beginning. What's interesting to note is that the double jump is so unimportant to Symphony of the Night. In most Metroidvanias like Jedi Fallen Order or Hollow Knight, it's one of the last major upgrades that you're expected to get. Instead, here, it's an early game pickup, barely a pit stop on the way to get the Form of Mist, and then the Soul of Bat shortly thereafter, which immediately supersedes the double jump by allowing you to gain an infinite amount of height by just flying up. Speaking of, to get to that Form of Bat, we need to do 2 more things. Namely, we need to go through the Colosseum Colosseum, which is in the middle of the Marble Gallery, and then also beat the Lesser Demon in the Long Library, so we're officially backtracking at this point. As I said before, the backtracking in this game isn't nearly as arduous as it was in Super Metroid, thanks to how intuitively Alucard controls compared to Samus. That said, it would be significantly worse without the stupid little backdash that doesn't really make any sense. And with that, let's transition a bit into story time. Throughout our journey in both the Marble Gallery and the Royal Chapel, Alucard runs into a young witch named Maria Renard, a former companion of Richter Belmont, who came to the castle to investigate it and look for him. She and Alucard find a tenuous agreement of searching for Richter, as he's the one who should be fighting to defeat Dracula once again, so it would only make sense for him to be in the castle. And oh boy is he! You find Richter in the Colosseum as he proclaims himself ruler of Dracula's castle, who aims to resurrect and kill the Dark Lord over and over again to retain his own relevance instead of fading into the background of history like his predecessors. This is what I meant when I said this game has a role reversal. Instead of a Belmont fighting a vampire, you play as a vampire fighting a Belmont. And with the Soul of Bat claimed, you're free to go kill Richter right now if you so desire, as all you need to do to get to him is to fly up to the top of the castle. However, if you do this, you get the bad ending. Yes, there are multiple endings in this game, something which a few future Metroidvanias would come to have as well, and in similar ways, honestly, like Hollow Knight. In order to get the true ending, though, we're going to need to explore the entirety of the castle, mostly for just one of the items that we need, while the other two are relatively simple. To start with one of the simple ones, there's a switch in the Marble Gallery which opens up access to the underground caverns, an area that's only interesting to us now that we've gotten all of this other stuff. Partway down, there's an offshoot where you can find a corrupted save room in which Alucard experiences a wide-awake nightmare, having to relive his mother's death by a stake burning for her relationship with Dracula. However, upon realizing that this form of his mother is spouting such hateful rhetoric that he knows she would never say, Alucard successfully sees through the illusion and, upon defeating the succubus responsible, you obtain the gold ring. What you have to do to get the corresponding silver ring is significantly more involved. In the Royal Chapel, because I said we would be going back there, remember, there's a room where Maria will be standing guard over the item for you. However, to get to that room, you have to be able to open this door, but there are spikes in that room. So you have to be able to break those spikes, so we need the spike breaker armor, but that's all the way down here. And to get that, we need to get through this room that's filled with spikes for some reason, and is also pitch black, so we need a way to get through a pitch black room. And to do that, we need to get the Echo of Bat upgrade from Orlox's quarters, which is up past the Colosseum. Got all that? Now, I gotta say, I absolutely love this kind of quest chain. Though I wish there was more of a tangible reward than a silver ring and some story bits, the process of working out solutions and finding your path through extensive exploration is just great. There is a tough balance, though. It's one thing if you look at it how I just did, but it paints things in a whole different light if you look at it step by step without knowing the end. Especially if you're trying to figure this out for the first time, you can easily become annoyed and or frustrated by a game giving you a minor reward only to immediately tell you to take it somewhere else to do something very specific with it. I think this particular line would be greatly improved by adding small offshoots to previous areas with dark rooms or rooms where you need the spike breaker armor, so it doesn't feel so much like story pickups and more like another movement or exploration upgrade a la the Leapstone or Form of Bat from earlier. With that said, gold and silver rings on our hands, you need to return to the clock room in the Marble Gallery, where a new path opens that leads us to Maria again, who knows that Richter is now evil, and after a short battle gives you the Holy Glasses, which shows magical illusions if any are present. And now, at this point, if we go face Richter at the top of the castle, we'll see an orb above his head, which is our main target. Once you destroy it, congratulations, you've beaten the good part of Symphony of the Night. From here, while the quality doesn't completely plummet, there is a noticeable decrease in interesting development in both the plot and the gameplay. It turns out that the dark priest called Shaft took control of Richter, and as part of his own ritual to resurrect Dracula, an entire copy of his castle appears upside down above the original, and now you have to explore it. All of it. The goal from here, which you can complete in any order, is to defeat 5 bosses from the original Castlevania, which grants you parts of Dracula's body, at which point you can confront Shaft and defeat the resurrected Dracula. This last part is actually pretty good though. You get some good characterization from both Alucard and Dracula, and while the game is an absolute cakewalk at this point, the spectacle alone sells the finale aspect of the climax. The issue is in the several hours leading up to that final encounter. I'm not kidding when I say that you go through the entire castle again, only upside down. This means heavy use of the bat transformation as a crutch for what is now awful level design of the reverse castle, complete with enemies that deal way too much fucking damage at first and not nearly enough by the end. There's also total non-linearity in terms of the intended order to go about things, since you can literally get anywhere, which is a bad thing in a level-based game because it makes the difficulty curve absolutely shit the bed. Finally, there's no more development on the movement or combat system. It's just a combat gauntlet, and not a very enjoyable one at that. Now look, I very much enjoyed my time with Castlevania Symphony of the Night, but the reverse castle was not a big part of that enjoyment. It's here that all of the problems that I have with the combat and exploration comes to the forefront when the regular castle was able to stave off the annoyance that came from them. The looseness of the combat, the lack of decent healing options outside of a screen-wide spell that's inconsistent at best, the bat transformation not being particularly fun to use and lacking any amount of depth, and the entire main thrust for exploration set up at the beginning, retrieving Alucard's lost loot, being extremely disappointing. Only one of them, Alucard's sword, is strictly locked behind a boss fight, that being Death himself. The other four, Alucard's shield, mail, the dragon helm, and the twilight cloak, are all just found throughout the inverted castle. Hell, the dragon helm can be picked up 30 seconds after getting there. Aside from the 5 bosses required to beat the game, there are 4 in the inverted castle. Galamoth, an illusion of the Castlevania 3 crew minus Alucard himself, a doppelganger rematch, and Beelzebub. Along with Death, why don't you get pieces of Alucard's equipment from defeating these powerful enemies? It would make the act of retrieving his stuff feel more purposeful and like an actual goal to strive for, rather than just stumbling across them blindly while you're just going through the game. And as a quick note on the same subject, the inverted castle's loot quality is shockingly poor. You tend to find a whole bunch of consumables, equipment that's barely worth the effort to get it, or story items from bosses. That's not to say that the loot quality in the rest of the game was particularly stellar though. The summons outside of the sword are fairly useless, many of the relics are at best quality of life type stuff, and while some equipment is good, a lot of the sword upgrades, the shield rod, the walk armor, that kind of thing, most of the time it feels superfluous anyway thanks to the game being so pathetically easy for large stretches of its runtime. And I want to stress again, I like Symphony of the Night. I like it a lot, and I think for all of its faults that it holds up really well to today's standards. Alucard handles smoothly, the exploration is shockingly intuitive for being this early into the Metroidvania genre, and while I think that a lot of the details are misses, there are a lot of hits too, particularly with the way the story is handled, the progression of exploration in the first part of the game anyway, and the spectacle of the bosses. Hell, I don't even hate the inverted castle, despite my complaints. While it is a significant step down from the regular one, there are some things that I like. I already talked about the way that the final encounter plays out, but I also like that every boss present within it, aside from Shaft and the Doppelganger rematch, is a legacy boss. From the illusion of Alucard's companions from Castlevania 3 to Galamoth returning from Kid Dracula of all games. It shows a real dedication to the developer's part to honor the history of the franchise in a very reverent and respectable way. As well, one of my favorite items in the entire genre can be found here after only one boss. In the inverted long library, you can find these small floating ghosts, and very rarely they drop the Chrysogrim. It has no animation when swung, is pretty powerful, and hits 4 times in rapid succession. It's by far the most broken item in the entire Castlevania franchise, and is so much fun to use, so long as you don't mind the grind to obtain it. I only went through this one area with it for the sake of fairness, but as we close out, you can see me going through the final bosses with it and seeing just how trivial it makes the game. Castlevania Symphony of the Night is a triumph, both in pioneering a new genre and as a continuation of its own franchise. It launched the career of Igarashi, who we will be seeing quite a few more times in this retrospective, and it basically destroyed the linear style of Castlevania in the 2D scene. While it left behind a lot of the series' prior elements, it more than made up for it with its depth of exploration and revamped combat system, which would arguably serve as the template for some of the most acclaimed Metroidvania games of the past decade, such as Hollow Knight and Ori and the Will of the Wisps. Symphony of the Night landed on the gaming scene and took off running, and though it started to stumble by the end, it still finished at the top of its class. Up next, we'd shift gears to a Metroidvania-like, rather than a strict member of the genre. How similar will it be? What elements are common or influenced by itself or by this genre? What can the Metroidvania genre take from it, and what is simply a relic of a bygone era of gaming? Join me next time as we dive into the most acclaimed game of all time, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. I can't wait to face the hate comments because Wind Waker is better. Until the end, my friends.